The first time I realized I was not actually invited to my own Famyly's anniversary dinner, I thought it was a mistake. My name is Daniel Brooks, and I remember standing in my apartment in Boston, holding my phone with a message from my mother that felt strangely cold for something that was supposed to be about family. The message was short, almost clinical. It might be better if you sit this one out. No explanation, no discussion, no emotion attached to it. Just a conclusion delivered like a decision already finalized somewhere without me. I stared at the screen for a long time, waiting for another message to correct it, to soften it, to add context. Nothing came. My parents, William Brooks and Margaret Brooks, were celebrating 30 years of marriage that weekend, and the entire family was supposed to gather at my sister's house outside Philadelphia. It was not just a casual dinner. It was supposed to be the kind of milestone event where everyone shows up, takes photos, and pretends for a few hours that everything is perfectly aligned. At least that was what I thought. He called my father first. He answered after a few rings, his voice calm in a way that immediately made me feel like I had already been excluded from a conversation I was not aware had started without me. He asked him directly if the message meant I was not invited. There was a pause on the line, long enough for me to hear background noise that sounded like movement, like he was not alone. Then he said, "It is just easier this way." He asked what that meant. Easier for who? He did not answer directly. Instead, he repeated that it was better not to complicate the evening and that I should understand the timing was not ideal. He remembers standing by my kitchen counter, gripping the phone tighter without realizing it, trying to process how an anniversary meant to represent family unity could suddenly include me as a complication. After the call ended, I immediately texted my sister, Emily Brooks. She replied almost instantly, but her message was brief. "Let it go, Daniel. It is just one night." No further explanation. No acknowledgement of how strange it felt to be removed from something I had always assumed I was part of by default. He tried calling her, but she did not pick up. That silence felt different from avoidance. It felt coordinated. As the day went on, I kept checking my phone, expecting someone to clarify what was happening. Instead, I noticed something else. The group chat for the family event was active, messages flowing between relatives about food, decorations, and seating arrangements. My name never appeared in any of it. Not once. It was not just that I had been told not to come. It was that the event itself had already adjusted to my absence without resistance. By evening, I learned that preparations were already underway at my sister's house. He saw photos of tables being set up, chairs arranged, and a backyard being decorated for what was described as a perfect family night. He was not in any of those images, nor referenced in any of the conversations attached to them. And yet, everything looked complete. That was the part that unsettled me the most. Not anger. Not confusion. But the quiet realization that a family event could continue to take shape without needing everyone it was supposed to include. And somewhere between those messages and those photos, I began to understand that my absence was not an accident. It was already part of the plan. The next morning began with a silence that felt heavier than the night before, not because anything had changed, but because nothing had been clarified. I woke up in my Boston apartment and instinctively checked my phone, expecting at least one message that would soften what I had read the previous day. Instead, there were only new updates about the anniversary preparations. Photos from my sister Emily's house showed floral arrangements being delivered, a table being set with precision, and chairs being aligned in a backyard that looked prepared for a carefully staged family gathering. My name was still absent from everything. Not once mentioned, not even indirectly referenced. He sat on the edge of my bed scrolling through those images, trying to reconcile how an event celebrating 30 years of marriage between my parents, William Brooks and Margaret Brooks, could move forward so completely without me. He called my mother first that morning. She answered after a delay, her voice calm in a way that immediately told me she had already accepted the direction of the situation. He asked her directly why I had been told not to attend. There was a brief pause before she responded that it was not about exclusion, but about keeping the evening simple and avoiding unnecessary tension. He asked her what tension she was referring to, because as far as I knew, nothing had happened to justify removing me from a family milestone. She did not answer the question directly. Instead, she said it would be better for everyone if I just understood and respected the decision. I remember standing in my kitchen holding the phone, staring at the countertop without actually seeing it, trying to process how a family event could become something that required my absence to function smoothly. After the call ended, I tried my father again. He answered quickly this time, but his tone was even more distant than before. He asked him if he agreed with what was happening. He said it was not about agreement, it was about avoiding complications during an important night. He asked him directly if my presence was considered a complication. There was another pause, longer this time, followed by a simple response that I was reading too much into it and that it was just one evening that should go smoothly without unnecessary discussion. That sentence stayed with me longer than I expected. One evening. As if 30 years of marriage could be reduced to a single night that required editing certain people out of it. Later that day, I checked the family group chat again. The conversation had become even more active. Relatives were coordinating arrival times, discussing seating arrangements, and confirming final details for the dinner. My name was still not mentioned anywhere. It was as if my absence had been normalized to the point where it no longer required explanation. Then I noticed something that made my attention stop completely. Famyly had posted a message in the group saying everything was ready and that she hoped it would be a perfect night for Mom and Dad. Attached to it was a photo of the decorated backyard, fully set up, glowing under warm evening lights, with carefully arranged tables and chairs that suggested everything was already complete. He studied that image for a long time. Not because it was surprising, but because it felt final. There was no gap left for adjustment, no indication that anything was missing. The event was not being prepared anymore. It was already becoming a finished story. He tried calling Emily again after that, but she did not respond. The silence this time felt more intentional than before. It was no longer about miscommunication or timing. It felt like the structure of the evening had already been sealed, and I was the only one still trying to enter a version of it that no longer had space for me. And as I sat there in my apartment watching updates continue to appear without my name in them, I began to understand that I was not waiting to be included. I was waiting to be acknowledged in something that had already decided I was not part of it. By the third day leading up to the anniversary dinner, I stopped trying to interpret the situation as a misunderstanding and began observing it as a pattern that was repeating with increasing clarity. Every message I received from my family now carried the same underlying structure. The event was moving forward, the preparations were complete, and my absence was no longer being discussed at all. It had become an accepted condition of the gathering rather than a point of discussion. I remember sitting at my desk in Boston that morning, looking at my phone as Emily posted another update in the family group chat. This time it was a short message confirming final timing for the evening, followed by another image of the backyard setup now fully decorated with warm lighting, neatly arranged tables, and floral arrangements that suggested everything was ready for guests to arrive. My name still did not appear anywhere in the conversation. Not in questions, not in reminders, not even in passing references. It was as if the structure of the event had been carefully rewritten to function without me in every possible sense. Later that afternoon, I called my sister again. She answered after a few rings, and her tone was calm but noticeably brief, as if she already knew what I was going to ask. He asked her directly why I was not included in the anniversary dinner. There was a short pause before she responded that it was not personal, but that Mom and Dad had decided it would be less complicated this way. He asked her what exactly was complicated about my presence. She did not give a direct answer. Instead, she said that sometimes family events go more smoothly when certain tensions are avoided, and that I should try to understand the bigger picture. I remember walking slowly across my apartment while listening to her, trying to understand how a family milestone could require emotional filtering to function. After the call ended, I sat down and looked again at the messages and photos from the past few days. Everything was consistent. The setup was complete, the guest list was finalized, and all coordination was proceeding without interruption. My absence was not being debated. It was already integrated into the structure of the evening. That night, I tried calling my mother one more time. She answered after a delay, her voice steady and composed. I asked her if she was aware that I had been completely excluded from the anniversary celebration. She responded calmly that it was not about exclusion, but about keeping the evening peaceful and focused on celebrating without unnecessary stress. I asked her what stress she was referring to, because nothing had happened recently that would justify removing me from a milestone event. She repeated that it was simply the decision that had been made and that I should respect it rather than question it. There was no anger in her voice, only certainty. After that call, I remained seated for a long time in silence, staring at the wall of my apartment without focusing on anything in particular. The realization was no longer forming slowly. It had already formed. It was not being temporarily left out of a celebration. It was being positioned outside of it entirely, in a way that required no explanation to anyone except me. The next morning, I saw the final confirmation post from Emily in the family chat. It was an image of the fully prepared dining setup, complete with place settings and soft lighting as evening approached. The caption simply read that everything was ready for the anniversary dinner and that it was going to be a perfect night. There was no mention of me, no question about my absence, and no acknowledgement that I had ever been part of the expected guest list. He stared at that image for a long time, not because it was dramatic, but because it was complete. The story of that evening had already been finalized without needing my presence to make it whole. And in that moment, I understood that I was no longer waiting to be invited into something. I was watching something unfold that had already decided it did not require me to exist within it. By the fourth day, the anniversary evening was no longer something I was trying to understand, it was something I was observing as it moved forward without me. The messages in the family group chat had become increasingly focused on final coordination. Seating arrangements were confirmed, timing was locked in, and Emily continued to post updates showing small details of preparation that made it clear the event was fully operational. Every image she shared reinforced the same message in a quiet but undeniable way. The dinner was happening exactly as planned, just without my presence. I found myself checking the chat more frequently than I intended, not because I expected to be included, but because I was trying to understand how something so closely tied to my family identity could proceed so smoothly without me in it. There was no confusion from anyone else. No questions. No last-minute adjustments. Everything was stable, complete, and self-contained. That afternoon, I called my father again. He answered after a few rings, his voice neutral and slightly distant. I asked him directly if he understood that I had been completely excluded from the anniversary dinner. There was a short pause before he responded that it was not about exclusion, but about keeping the evening simple and avoiding unnecessary complications. I asked him again what complication he was referring to, because from my perspective there had been no conflict that would justify removing me from a milestone event. He replied calmly that sometimes family gatherings go more smoothly when everyone agrees on the same atmosphere, and that this was one of those situations where it was better not to create tension. His tone suggested that the decision was already final and no longer open for discussion. After the call ended, I sat in my apartment in Boston for a long time without moving. He looked at my phone again and saw another post from Emily. It was a photo of the dining area fully prepared, candles lit, table settings arranged perfectly, and soft lighting filling the backyard as evening approached. The caption said everything was ready for a perfect celebration. My name was not mentioned anywhere in the post or in the comments that followed. No one asked why I was absent. No one questioned the completeness of the gathering. It was as if my absence had become a silent agreement shared by everyone involved. Later that night, I called my mother one last time before the event. She answered after a delay, her voice steady and composed. I asked her directly if she realized I had been excluded from the anniversary dinner. She responded that it was not about exclusion, but about making sure the evening stayed peaceful and focused on celebrating without unnecessary stress. I asked her what stress she was referring to, because I had not been involved in anything that would disrupt the occasion. She repeated that it was simply the decision that had been made and that I should respect it rather than question it further. There was no emotion in her voice, only certainty, as if the conversation itself had already been concluded long before I called. After the call ended, I remained seated in silence, staring at the floor of my apartment as the reality of the situation settled in fully. I was not being excluded in the middle of a conflict. I was being positioned outside of something that had already been completed in everyone else's understanding. The next evening, I saw the first photos from the anniversary dinner appear in the group chat. The table was full, the lighting was warm, and every detail reflected careful planning and celebration. My parents were smiling in the center of the image, surrounded by family members who had all gathered without hesitation. There was no gap in the composition, no visible absence, no indication that anyone was missing. As I looked at those images, I realized that the event had not only taken place without me, it had taken place without needing to acknowledge that I should have been part of it at all. And in that moment, I understood something I had not fully accepted before. I was not simply left out of a family gathering. I had been removed from the version of the story where my presence was ever necessary. By the fifth day, the anniversary dinner had already happened, and what remained was no longer anticipation but aftermath. I learned this not through a message directed to me, but through the steady appearance of photos and comments circulating in the family group chat. The event was over, completed, and documented in a way that made it feel permanently fixed in place. Every image showed a carefully arranged celebration, my parents at the center of attention, surrounded by family members who appeared relaxed and unified. There was laughter in the photos, glasses raised, and warm lighting that made the evening look seamless and intentional in every detail. My absence, however, was not visible because it had already been fully absorbed into the structure of the event before it began. I sat in my apartment in Boston scrolling through the images repeatedly, not looking for evidence of exclusion anymore, but trying to understand how absence can be so completely normalized that it no longer requires acknowledgement. There was no message from my parents after the event. No follow-up explanation, no attempt to revisit the conversation, no indication that anything unusual had occurred. It was as if the entire decision to proceed without me had been so settled in advance that it did not require reflection afterward. Later that evening, I called my mother. She answered after a few rings, her voice calm and steady, carrying none of the tension I had expected after seeing the photos. I asked her directly how the dinner went. She said it was very nice, that everything went smoothly, and that everyone enjoyed themselves. There was no hesitation in her tone, no sense that anything had been difficult or questionable. I then asked her if she felt my absence had changed anything about the evening. There was a short pause before she replied that it had not, because the focus of the night had been on celebrating without distractions or unnecessary emotional complications. I remember standing near my kitchen counter while listening to her, realizing that the word distraction had replaced what I would have considered presence. I asked her if she understood that I had been intentionally excluded. She responded calmly that it was not about exclusion, but about making decisions that ensured the event felt comfortable for everyone involved. There was no apology, no conflict, only a quiet finality in her explanation that suggested the interpretation had already been fully resolved on their side. After the call ended, I remained still for a long time, looking at the reflection of my phone screen on the counter without really seeing it. He opened the group chat again and scrolled through the final set of photos. The dinner had been documented from start to finish. The seating was perfect, the lighting was warm, and every frame showed a complete family structure that did not include me. No one in the comments mentioned my absence. No relative asked why I was not there. The narrative had not been interrupted by my missing presence because it had already been constructed in a way that did not require it. That realization settled slowly but completely. He had not been removed during the event. He had been removed from the version of the event that existed in everyone else's understanding before it even took place. And in that silence, I began to understand that I was no longer reacting to what happened, but to the fact that I had already been written out of it. By the 6th day after the anniversary dinner, the silence surrounding me had changed its quality. It was no longer the silence of anticipation or exclusion in progress. It had become the silence that follows completion, where events are no longer unfolding but already finalized in the memory of everyone involved except me. He had stopped receiving updates from my family entirely. No new photos, no additional messages, no indirect references to the evening that had taken place. It was as if the moment had closed fully on their side while I remained outside of it, still processing something that had already been resolved elsewhere. I remember sitting at my desk in Boston that morning, scrolling through the last set of images from the dinner again. The table was full, the lighting was warm, and every expression in the photos suggested ease and familiarity. My parents, William Brooks and Margaret Brooks, appeared at the center of each frame surrounded by family members who had all gathered without hesitation. The composition of every image reinforced the same message. The evening had not only taken place without me, it had been structured in a way that required no visible absence to feel complete. Later that day, I called my father. He answered after a few rings, his tone neutral and slightly distant, as though the conversation was an interruption rather than a continuation of anything ongoing. He asked him directly if he felt my absence had affected the dinner in any way. There was a brief pause before he responded that everything had gone well and that everyone had enjoyed themselves. He asked him if he believed the evening would have been different had I been there. He replied calmly that it was better not to complicate things on a night meant for celebration and that sometimes simplicity helps everyone enjoy the moment more fully. He remembers standing still while listening to him, trying to process how my presence could be interpreted as complexity rather than participation in a family milestone. After the call ended, I sat for a long time without moving, looking at the reflection of my phone on the desk surface. The realization was no longer forming slowly. It had already settled into something concrete. He was not part of a decision made during the event. He was part of a decision made before it ever began. That evening, I opened the family group chat again. There were no new messages related to the dinner, but the existing photos continued to circulate through comments and reactions. People were discussing how beautiful the evening had been, how well everything had come together, and how meaningful it felt to celebrate 30 years of marriage in such a complete setting. My name did not appear anywhere in those conversations. Not as a missing presence, not as an afterthought, not even as a point of curiosity. It was as if the structure of the story had been designed in a way that no longer required my position to be acknowledged at all. He tried calling my mother one more time later that night. She answered after a delay, her voice calm and steady. He asked her if she understood that I had been intentionally excluded from the anniversary dinner. She responded that it was not about exclusion, but about making choices that ensured the evening remained peaceful and focused on celebration without unnecessary tension. He asked her what tension she believed I would have brought. She said it was not about what I would do, but about how certain dynamics affect the atmosphere of family events, and that this was simply the decision that made things easier for everyone. There was no emotional weight in her explanation, only certainty that the outcome was appropriate. After the call ended, I remained seated in silence for a long time. The apartment around me felt unchanged, But something in my understanding had shifted completely. He was no longer trying to enter an event that had already passed. He was confronting the fact that the version of the event that included me had never been the one they were building in the first place. And in that realization, I understood that I was not absent from the anniversary dinner. He had been removed from the version of it that mattered to everyone except me. By the seventh day, I no longer checked my phone with the expectation of receiving anything new from my family. The anniversary dinner had already happened, the photos had already circulated, and the silence that followed had settled into something permanent. What remained was not uncertainty, but confirmation that my absence had been fully absorbed into the final version of the event. There was no follow-up message from my parents, no attempt to revisit the conversation, and no indication that anything about the situation required further explanation on their side. It felt as if the entire chapter had been closed without me ever being present inside it. I remember sitting at my desk in Boston that morning, opening the family group chat once more out of habit rather than expectation. The images were still there, unchanged. My parents, William Brooks and Margaret Brooks, smiling at the center of a perfectly arranged table surrounded by relatives who had gathered in celebration. Every photo carried the same impression of completeness. There was no empty seat that suggested absence, no visible gap that hinted at something missing. Even in the comments beneath the photos, the tone remained consistent. People described the evening as beautiful, meaningful, and perfectly organized. My name did not appear anywhere in the discussion. Not once. Not even in passing. That absence was not being questioned. It was being accepted as part of the structure of the night. Later that day, I called my sister, Emily Brooks, hoping for some form of explanation that might still connect me to what had happened. She answered after a few rings, her voice calm but slightly distant. I asked her directly why I had been excluded from the anniversary dinner. There was a short pause before she responded that it was not personal, but that Mom and Dad had wanted the evening to feel simple and peaceful without any added tension. I asked her what tension she believed my presence would have created. She did not answer that question directly. Instead, she repeated that it was a decision made for the benefit of the atmosphere and that sometimes family events go more smoothly when everything is kept uncomplicated. I remember standing in my kitchen while listening to her, realizing how consistently the explanation avoided anything specific about me while still resulting in my complete absence. After the call ended, I sat down and looked again at the photos from the dinner. The arrangement was unchanged, the smiles were consistent, and the event itself appeared fully realized in every visual detail. It was not a partial gathering. It was not an incomplete version of something larger. It was a finished scene that no longer contained space for reinterpretation. That evening, I tried calling my mother once more. She answered after a delay, her voice steady and composed. I asked her if she understood that I had been intentionally excluded from the anniversary dinner. She responded calmly that it was not about exclusion, but about making decisions that ensured the evening remained focused on celebration without unnecessary emotional complications. I asked her what those complications were. She said it was not about anything specific I had done, but about the general dynamics of family gatherings and how certain presences can shift the overall tone of an event. Her explanation was not emotional. It was structured, final, and already settled in her mind. There was no opening left for further discussion. After the call ended, I remained seated in silence for a long time. The apartment around me felt unchanged, but my understanding of what had happened no longer carried any uncertainty. I was no longer trying to understand why I had been left out of a family celebration. I was realizing that the version of the celebration that included me had never been the one they intended to create. And in that realization, I understood fully that I had not simply been excluded from an anniversary dinner. I had been removed from the narrative of it entirely. By the 8th day, the anniversary dinner no longer existed as an event I was waiting to understand. It existed only as something already completed, documented, and socially finalized within my family's world. What remained for me was not anticipation or confusion, but the slow recognition that no further explanation was coming. My parents had not reached out since the dinner, and my sister Emily had not responded to my last attempt at contact. The silence was no longer situational. It had become structural. I remember sitting at my desk in Boston that morning, opening the family group chat out of habit rather than expectation. The photos from the anniversary dinner were still there, unchanged, showing my parents. William Brooks and Margaret Brooks at the center of a perfectly arranged evening surrounded by relatives who appeared fully unified in celebration. The composition of every image remained consistent. There was no visual suggestion that anything or anyone had been missing. Even the conversations beneath the photos continued normally, focused on how successful and beautiful the evening had been. My absence was not referenced. Not directly. Not indirectly. Not even as an omission. It was simply not part of the version of events that had been recorded and shared. Later that day, I called my father again, not because I expected a different answer, but because I needed to confirm whether anything had changed in how the situation was being understood. He answered after a few rings, his tone calm and slightly distant, as if the conversation itself was already resolved before it began. He asked him directly if he believed it was fair that I had been excluded from the anniversary dinner. There was a brief pause before he responded that it was not about fairness, but about maintaining a peaceful atmosphere during an important family moment. He asked him what he meant by peaceful atmosphere, because from my perspective, my presence had never been associated with disruption. He replied that it was not about anything specific I had done, but about how certain dynamics influence group settings and that sometimes the simplest choice is to avoid introducing variables that might shift the tone of an event. His explanation was steady and structured, as if it had been repeated internally long before it was spoken to me. After the call ended, I remained seated for a long time without moving. The apartment around me was quiet, but the silence no longer felt like something surrounding me. It felt like something confirming a conclusion that had already been reached elsewhere. That evening, I checked the group chat one more time. There were no new posts about the dinner, but the existing images continued to circulate in reactions and comments. People described the event as warm, memorable, and perfectly executed. My name did not appear anywhere in the discussion. There were no questions. No curiosity. No acknowledgement of absence. It was as if the entire structure of the evening had been constructed in such a way that completeness did not require my inclusion to be recognized as complete. He tried calling my sister Emily again that night. She answered after a delay, her voice calm but slightly guarded. He asked her again why I had been excluded from the anniversary dinner. She repeated what I had already heard, that it was not personal, but a decision made to ensure the evening remained simple and focused on celebration without emotional complexity. He asked her what part of my presence she considered emotional complexity. She did not answer directly. Instead, she said that sometimes family decisions are made collectively with the goal of maintaining harmony, and that not every choice requires individual justification once the outcome has already been agreed upon. After that call ended, I sat in silence for a long time, realizing that I was no longer receiving explanations. He was receiving confirmations of a decision that had already been fully integrated into their version of reality. And in that realization, I understood that I was not waiting for closure anymore. He was already living inside it. By the 9th day, the anniversary dinner had fully transitioned from a living event into a fixed memory within my family's narrative, one that no longer required my presence to function in any form. There were no new messages, no further updates, and no attempts to revisit the conversation from my parents or my sister Emily. What remained was complete silence, not as absence of communication, but as confirmation that the situation had already been settled in everyone else's understanding. I found myself sitting at my desk in Boston that morning, opening the family group chat one final time not because I expected anything to change, but because I needed to see whether there was any trace of reconsideration left. The images were still there, unchanged. My parents William Brooks and Margaret Brooks remained at the center of every photo, surrounded by family members who appeared unified, comfortable, and fully present in the celebration. The arrangement of every image suggested completion, as if nothing had been missing at any point in the evening. There was no space left in the visual record for absence, no gap that suggested interruption, no indication that any alternative version of the event had ever existed. Even the comments beneath the photos continued to reinforce the same interpretation. The dinner had been perfect, meaningful, and completely successful. My name was absent not only from the images but from the language surrounding them, as if it had never been part of the expected structure at all. Later that day, I called my father one final time. He answered after a few rings, his voice steady and familiar, but distant in a way that no longer surprised me. He asked him directly if he believed anything about the anniversary dinner would have changed had I been there. There was a pause before he responded that the evening had gone exactly as intended and that everyone had enjoyed themselves without any complications. He asked him if he understood that I had been excluded from it entirely. He replied calmly that it was not about exclusion, but about ensuring the focus remained on celebrating without unnecessary emotional disruption. He asked him what disruption he believed my presence would have created. His answer did not change. He said it was not about a specific incident, but about maintaining a certain atmosphere where everything flows smoothly without additional tension. There was no hesitation in his voice, only the certainty of a conclusion that had already been accepted long before I asked the question. After the call ended, I remained seated in silence for a long time, looking at nothing in particular while the realization settled more deeply than before. This was no longer about understanding why I had been left out of an event. It was about recognizing that the event had been constructed in a way that never required my inclusion to feel complete in the first place. That evening, I opened the group chat one last time. There were no new messages, only the same images from the anniversary dinner, still circulating through reactions and comments that treated the night as fully resolved. People spoke about it as if it had always been whole, as if nothing had ever been missing from it at any stage. There was no question, no curiosity, and no reinterpretation of what had occurred. My absence had not become a topic. It had become a fact that no longer needed acknowledgement. I closed my laptop slowly and sat back, understanding that there would be no final explanation, no correction, and no reintegration into the version of the story that had been shared. What had happened was not a misunderstanding that could be revisited. It was a narrative that had already been finalized without me as part of its structure. And in that final silence, I realized that I was not waiting to be included anymore, because the story had already ended without ever needing me inside it.